Hi everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about, or try and give some evidence, experimental evidence, suggesting that gesture is the primary means for getting a communication system started. And unlike many of the people, but not all of them, I'll use modern humans who are trying to create communication systems in the lab when we sort of prohibit them from using their existing language system and try and get them to create a new one. That's the approach. So, oh, okay, I've already messed up with this. I don't know how to work this then. Shouldn't be that complicated. All right. So, as everyone's talked about, there's a whole bunch. Everyone and their dog's got a theory of language origin. The two dominant ones are language emerged from non-linguistic vocalization of our nearest ancestors, or the gestural one. And then, of course, more recently, people are getting very interested in this multimodal account as well, as we've heard, right? So what we've done is we've taken an experimental semiotic approach, been pioneered by people like Bruno Galantucci and others. And the idea, very basically, is that because you can't go back in time, we don't have a time machine, what we'll do is we'll operate in the present time and we'll use modern humans, and we'll try to see what we can learn by getting them to create communication systems under laboratory conditions, where we prohibit them from using their existing language and see how they solve the problem. Hopefully that can shed some light on how we did this, many thousands of years ago. So some of the studies that we've done is we've looked at, we've published a couple of papers, we've looked at how gesture sort of stacks up against non-linguistic vocalization as a means of creating a communication system from scratch. And that's what I'll talk about, this particular paradigm in this talk. If you want to hear more about this, Casey Lister, who's over here, she's given 2 more talks, one today and one on Tuesday. And this uses this paradigm to get at these questions. Okay, so I'll just tell you what the paradigm is about, right? You get, typically, but not always, you get 2 people into the lab, a dyad, going to work together to solve this problem. And you generate a whole bunch of meanings, just words, and one person has to communicate the word in such a way that their partner can understand which of the words from a list of about 16 they're trying to communicate, okay? And what we say to them, either do this using gesture but nothing else, which they're kind of a little bit self-conscious, but then they get really into it, as you'll see in a moment. Or we say, do it using non-linguistic vocalization, so you make sounds but you can't use any words, which they end up self-conscious throughout the entire experiment doing that. Or we say to them, you can use gesture and non-linguistic vocalization, so you can have a sort of multimodal approach to the problem, And this is what happens when people play the game using gesture. And they play the game again and again and again and again. And by doing that, we can look at how the sign system itself adapts and evolves to the task. So this is a pair of people, first time they play it. This guy is communicating whole to this girl, and she's trying to figure out which one she's trying to communicate. And then they do a whole bunch of things, then she tries to communicate whole to him. Then it's back to him. And you can see he changes it a little bit.
Yeah.
Ten.
Yeah.
Yeah. 11.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. 3.
Yeah.
So you can see that they're negotiating as they're going. In the initial sign, they use changes, and it becomes this sort of digging thing. It becomes quite kind of schematic a little bit toward the end. This is a pair doing the vocalization condition. Poor people. It's very challenging, as you'll see. This is trying to communicate washing. And his partner gets it wrong. So he's trying to communicate washing. And his partner gets it correct. Another guy's trying to communicate tree. using the same sound as he used to communicate washing, which he gets wrong. And then they get that incorrect as well, which is very challenging for them to communicate using non-linguistic vocalization. So this is basically what we find in these experiments. We've shown this again and again. This is communication accuracy here, and this is, they played 12 games, so look how it changes over time. And this is there's a range of different words they communicate. Some are emotion words, some are action words, and some are object words. So first of all, let's just look at the gesture modality. And what you can see is they start off around 70%, and they're up to about 100% after about 3 or 4 games. They're like super effective at this, and there's no difference between the different types of words they're communicating. Whereas the vocal condition is a bit of a disaster, really. They're maybe averaging about 40–50%, and they go up to about 70%, which is way higher than chance. But they're nowhere near as good as they are in gesture. And what you can also see is that if you're communicating using vocalization, it's pretty good for emotions, the blue one. It's also pretty good for actions, and it's not so good for objects as well, even though it can get better. The interesting thing is that the combined condition does not provide an advantage over gesture alone. In fact, what we sometimes find is that adding vocalization makes communication less successful in the multimodal condition. So, but you're kind of a bit restricted on range here because they're just so good at it. Okay, so that's kind of the background. So the first experiment is really about saying, well, we've used these weird samples of undergraduate psychology students. Let's go beyond that a little bit. And one of the reasons it's quite useful to go beyond that is that the concern is that with some of the participants in these experiments, they were using sort of semi-conventional gestures, whereas with the vocalization condition, you've prohibited that altogether. So it might advantage them in the gesture modality because there is some shadedness in the gestures that doesn't exist for the vocalizations. That's not strictly true, but you could argue that. So basically we did a cross-cultural study, and the idea was to try to eliminate any culturally shared gestures, or as much as possible to do that, so they wouldn't have a shared cultural repertoire. So to do that, we went to Vanuatu. In fact, we went to Pentecost Island, and we recruited participants from there to play this game. Okay. So we get 30 Vanuatu producers from Pentecost Island. The mean age was 32, mostly males, a few females. And then what we did is we got 30 participants from Australia, and we matched them to the Vanuatu people on age and gender as well. And then what we did is we used a very large set of stimuli. We had 183 basic English words. And we had to use basic words because initially we used complex words and no one understood what republic meant. They didn't know how to begin to communicate that, so we had to change the word list and make them really simple. And that works pretty well. If you're wondering what this is, it turns out people in Pentecost Island are kind of known for bungee jumping. So as I found out on Google Images, so yeah, there we go. Okay, so here's what they do in this experiment, right? You've got 60 producers, 30 from Vanuatu, 30 age and gender match from Australia. What you would do is you would look at the person with a video camera, you would read out the word to the participant. It would be translated to Vislama for our people from Vanuatu, and they would try to communicate the word to the video camera using either gesture or non-linguistic vocalization. Okay? They did 36 trials, 2 18-word blocks. They would do either in gesture first, then vocalization, or vocalization first and then gesture. That's the way it went. And then what we'd do is we'd get all these recordings, and then we'd get a whole bunch of interpreters. I think we'd 50 undergraduate students, and we'd sample from these, and they would try and guess what the person was trying to communicate. Does that make sense? So I'll kind of show you what the interpretation phase looked like. So we did it all in the computer. We'd have a whole bunch of words, and they have to figure out which one the person was trying to communicate. So they press the button to look at it, and here's one of our Western Australian students, and he's trying to communicate the word bag. So we use like a sort of standard shopping bag, I suppose, you know. Here's our age and gender matched Vanuatu participant, and he's trying to communicate bag as well. But what you can see, he does it very differently, because there they've got these sort of woven bags that they put on their shoulders like a backpack, and then when they kind of climb trees and stuff, they can put things in the back. So very kind of context-sensitive communication. Here's one of our producers, age and gender match from Australia, and he's communicating chain, this guy. Just kind of showing you the links in the chain. And here's our matched guy from Vanuatu communicating chain. Now, for him, the context is fishing. And that's where he, it's a sort of salient way of communicating chain. So this is our results from the experiment. First of all, I'll just look at the number of trials they skipped and how it might have been a functional modality. What you find is they didn't skip many trials at all, so there wasn't anything to worry about there. What about communication success? Well, for gesture, Australian interpreters interpreting Australian producers, gesture is much more effective than vocalization. Now, Australian interpreters interpreting people from Vanuatu, gesture was much more effective than vocalization. But there were cultural sensitivities, which you can see that accuracy is lower overall here than it is there. So people from different cultures didn't understand them quite as well, but gesture was always more effective. Okay, so that's the results of experiment 1. I've got another result that I think is probably the most interesting one. One of the things we wanted to look at was the universality of the gestures and the universality of the vocalizations. So this is what we did. Each person from each country, we take, say they communicated the word chain, we take that gesture or vocalization and we compare it to any other person who communicated the word chain in the same modality. And we'd rate them for how similar they were. To try to get at this idea, perhaps people were solving the problem in the same way in the gesture modality as opposed to the vocal modality. There's more salient gestures being used across cultures. This is what we found. So this is Australian gesturers or vocalizers being matched with Australian gesturers or vocalizers. And what you find is the gestures they use are more similar than the vocalizations they use. You can do the same thing for the people from Vanuatu, and you get much the same pattern. The gestures look more similar than the vocalizations sound. And then you can take people from Australia and people from Vanuatu and see if they're solving the problem in a similar way. And they are. So people who are gesturing in Australia look more like people who are gesturing in Vanuatu than people who are vocalizing in Australia look less like people who are vocalizing in Vanuatu. But of course, again, you get cultural sensitivities as well. Okay, so that's extreme experiment 1. Now on to extreme experiment 2. So what we did in extreme experiment 2 is we got sighted and blind producers. So we got blind people to do the game as well, not as interpreters, just as producers. And the idea here is we wanted to remove any shared visual culture. Again, getting at this idea of the naturalness of gesture. So ideally what we hope for is that blind people would gesture in the same way as sighted people, indicating its naturalness as a means of communication. So it's more or less exactly the same experiment as the one I just spoke to you about. So we get 10 blind producers, 5 were blind from birth, the rest were kind of closely blind very soon after, at 1.8 years of age, very, very low visual acuity, about 10%. And then we've got 10 sighted producers, age, gender, and education level matched in this case as well. Here we used an even larger stimuli set, so we had 1,260 English words, some of which were quite complex, in fact. We'll get to that in a moment. So again, this is nouns, verbs, and adjectives. And what the producers would do, they would communicate 24 nouns, 24 verbs, and 24 adjectives, half of which they would do this in gesture, half of which they would do this in vocalization as well. And then we got 90 undergraduate students to which one they thought the person was trying to communicate. So again, exactly the same format as before. We can look at the proportion of skipped trials. This was a harder task, no doubt about it. Some of the words were really tricky to communicate in vocalization and gesture. So what you find is people skipped more trials in the vocal modality than in the gesture modality, indicating this is harder. And also, when you think about communication success, they were able to avoid a lot of the really hard ones. So this should benefit the vocal modality. much more than the gesture modality. But despite that, we see exactly the same pattern again. The pattern being that for the sighted people, there was much higher accuracy in interpreting their gestures than in the vocal modality, so we see that once more. And exactly the same for the blind people, although the effect was a bit more muted. So what you can see here is that they don't share the same visual culture, which hinders them, right? So their ability to communicate in the gesture modality was lower than here, but nevertheless it was still higher than in the vocal modality. And what's nice is their ability in the vocal modality was identical to the sighted people, and that's because they both share the same vocal culture, right? You get this effect here, but nevertheless gesture is better once more. So the final analysis is the one I talked about before. So what we did is we took the gestures for each word, so like, again, chain, and we said, how similar is it to somebody else who communicated that word, either sighted or blind? And the same for vocalizations as well. What we find is that among sighted people, so if you take chain from one sighted person and chain from another sighted person who never met, never interacted, the gestures look more similar than the vocalizations. Again, it's a natural as a gesture. What about the blind people? Same thing. The gestures look more similar than the vocalizations. And what about if you take a blind person and pair them with a sighted person communicating the same word and the different modalities? The gestures look more similar to a sighted person than the vocalizations, and in fact there's no difference in these. So the blind people are kind of look like sighted people in as much as the types of gestures they produce. Okay, so just to kind of conclude, the evidence all says gestures better than vocal when you're creating a communication system from scratch. We see this cross-culturally, and we see it among blind people as well. So two quite extreme groups showing the same pattern. We also see evidence of gesture universality. It seems just like much more natural modality for language creation compared to vocalization. So the gestures used to communicate the meanings were more salient and more similar than the non-linguistic vocalizations. And these finds, I think, support a sort of embodied account of communication, that all of these people have bodies, all of these people use their bodies to interact in the world, and all of these people probably find solutions that are pretty similar to the solutions found by other people who have bodies and use those bodies to interact in the world as well. Okay, I'll finish there.